It's Thursday, the Thursday before Easter. This day of Holy Week is a day that we recall the history of the Passover. And it's when God's hand leads the Hebrew people out of bondage and slavery through the blood and unblemished lamb. Today, we recall the history of the Last Supper in which God's hand leads the disciples, you and I, out of years of slavery to sin and evil through the body and the blood of another spotless lamb, the Lamb of God, Jesus the Christ. However, just remembering does not do justice to the events of the Passover and the washing of feet during the Last Supper. See, these events, they have ongoing, present significance for us believers right now today and for everyone who follows in the future. See, the scriptures that are assigned to this portion of history are not elaborate instructions to simply serve as reminders of the past. They are real events. They really happened, and they have new and fresh meaning to each and every generation. See, the daunting task that lies before me in just these next couple minutes is to represent the hand of God's work to you and to recreate the event in a new and meaningful way, so that the occurrence is not just some historical event, but it becomes so real, so meaningful, and so alive to you and I that we actually experience freedom from slavery. First, before we even really dig into this today, we have to travel back some 4,000 years to a time that was much different than today, but yet really not so different. You see, the Hebrews, a small, insignificant nation of sinful people, they had fallen into slavery due to certain circumstances, but they had lived in slavery for so long. It had been 400 years that some of them probably had no idea things could be any different. They just figured this was how life was supposed to be. Others may have desired freedom of some type, but they had been enslaved for so long that if there was a God, and maybe they had heard about a God that their ancestors talked about, this God must have forgotten about them, or worse yet, he didn't care. But I want to tell you something today. God did not forget about them. And more importantly, God did care. You see, slavery and bondage was not the way that life was supposed to be. God didn't plan it that way. So God's hand sets into motion a dramatic action to provide freedom from this sin and evil. See, God sends Moses. He picks a deliverer, Moses, and he sends him 9 times to the Egyptian Pharaoh, and he demands the Pharaoh to set his people free. But each time that he goes, God sends these miraculous plagues on the land, different ones, like he turned the Nile River into blood. There were millions of grasshoppers throughout the land on one of those plagues. And in some weird sort of way, these plagues could be called sacraments, mysteries. They were mysteries that could not be explained, but contained the work of God's hand, leading to freedom from sin and bondage. Anyway, each time that Moses showed up, Pharaoh said no. But before Moses made his 10th and final visit to Pharaoh, see, God tells the children, he says this, he says, listen, I want you to be ready to move quickly. So they're to eat unleavened bread because there was no time for it to rise, and they're to kill a blemish-free lamb and then smear the lamb's blood above the door of their house. That night, after Pharaoh said no once again, an angel of death passed through Egypt, and the next morning the oldest male in each household was found dead, except all of those that were in the homes where the lamb's blood was put over the door. Here, the angel of death simply passed over. See, the Hebrews were released from bondage of slavery, and they passed safely through the Red Sea, through the waters of baptism, and they set out for a new life of freedom with God's commandments in hand. Now, through the celebration of the Passover, the bread and the blood of the Lamb become symbols of promised freedom from sin and evil in our lives. The work of God's hands are revealed. Now, I want us to do this. Fast forward 2,000 years later. Now, we're 2,000 years later, but it's still 2,000 years ago from where we are today. And the work of God's hands in the Passover is recreated in a spectacular manner. Here, the spotless, unblemished Lamb is the Son of God. In John chapter 13, I'm not going to read this passage, but I want you just to know it for reference. We find that it is now the hands of Jesus that take the bread. He breaks it and he offers it as his body. It is now the hands of Jesus that hold the cup. He blesses it and he shares it as his blood. It is the last night before those beautiful hands have nails driven through them with a purpose in mind of changing the course of a broken world. I remember an old song we used to sing, and you can still hear it from time to time. It says, he's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole wide world in his hands. You know, it's these loving, pierced hands of Jesus Christ offering you and I his body and blood through the bread and wine, promising you and I deliverance from the bondage of sin and darkness. But just like the Hebrews, this is really what's hard for us to imagine. But just like the Hebrews, some of us have lived in slavery for so long that we have no idea things could be any different. Others may have longed for this freedom, but figure God has forgotten about you, or worse yet, that he doesn't care. But I want to tell you something. God did not forget about you. And better yet, God does care for you. Slavery to sin and evil is not the way life is meant to be. So God comes to live among us in person, in Jesus, in a way that cannot be explained. And he becomes that spotless, unblemished Lamb. With his blood spread on the doorpost of our hearts, we can be released from bondage of slavery. We can pass to safety through the waters of baptism, and we set out for a whole new life of freedom, strengthened by his body. You would think the story would end there, but Jesus, on this Thursday before Easter, right before his crucifixion really begins to unfold, he ties a towel around himself and he begins to wash the disciples' feet. You see, he washes even Judas' feet, the one who betrays him. He washes even our feet, the ones who still betray him. You see, Jesus washes the dirt of the world and sin out of our lives. And once again, so you and I don't have to exist in that bondage any longer. But see, he's really taking us from our old identity and reminding us that we're new in him. See, the hands of Jesus that wash disciples' feet are not only a kind and humble act of forgiveness. These hands that Jesus used to wash the disciples' feet, they're a sign. They're a sacrament, if you may, of how we are to live. It is a visible action joined with a new commandment that we are to love one another just as Jesus has loved you. You see, these are holy hands commanding that we serve one another with humility each and every single day. The hands of Jesus breaking the bread and pouring the wine are not only a last meal to remember, but I believe more than ever it's about reminding you of who you are in him. You see, the hands of Jesus are holy hands. The hands of a Savior, the hands of a God are reaching out to you and today saying, don't forget whose you are.